The targeting of Don Senior Bowles from the record included, but was not limited to, the function of their attacks against his posterity in the laundered subject of their discovery of the military secrets by acquiring it from their double agents, which has asserted their preemption of the concept of David or intelligence oversight for the white hats, who then would be countering the black hats who were actively selling the prospect of having additional excessive powers, which were sold under the pretense, such as in the church committee, um, for being limited by the white hats who would keep them honest, who were then systemically undermined. And their discovery from the intelligence of the idea of David allowed them to find Don Senior Bowles, which allowed for their ability to have undermined him from birth, tracking the posterity, simply having to find who was going to be the thing. And their capacity from their stalking systems, from the surveillance terrorist operations such as COINTELPRO, MKUltra, and many of the other subversions, such as the criminal function of the United States military to engage in fake experiments as a function of hate crimes against the general public, protected against the Constitution by double agent judges who acquired the position as an accelerant for their Confederate loyalties against the United States to attack the Constitution in the usurpation by the systemic insurrection, infiltrating the system, creating the use of that military deadly weapon in order to substantively change um, the public by the hate crimes for the purpose of the various forms of hate crimes, such as the barring of the freedom of association by those military pieces of equipment to engage in the subversions and smear factories, the economic exchanges founded on those social connections, and the political functions derived by the freedom of speech created by the money from the commercial exchanges, such as in the case of their estimate of David, who would be on the majority, the aristocracy, which would have chosen the Senate, requiring the retaliation, and thus the pretense for their attacks generates the position of whether or not they were able to corrupt David, and their assertion from their connection with their communist affiliates was that there was no capacity to corrupt David on that mentality, and all they could do was buy him off, which would kick the can down the road, which is their generic economic strategy when dealing with the Western countries, which is a strategy of their insurrection, and as it is a strategy of war to overthrow the government as a parasite and not a functional mentality, uh, they rejected that in favor of actually dealing with the problem, which is the fact that the West is owed the capacity to form governments under law, and thus they have to make war with the rule of law. And thus, in that engagement, the assertion goes from their testing of the targets which they would have access to from those systems and making those estimates label David as an infant, as hypermasculine, creating the retaliations against that masculinity, generating the pretense that if his hypermasculinity in that scenario wasn't restrained, then they, having to pay him, would then have to send him the rest of the value, such as the supermodels and actors and the rest of it, which would then systematically undermine the rape culture, as the existence of masculinity undermines their beta society. And thus, their beta society has a fake masculinity without actual functioning male leadership, as it is a exploitative system in order to have the controls, to have the Plato's conspiracy control the sexual options and thus they can't actually have any leadership, as that would assert their independent decisions and the crafting of their own ambitions into base reality, as opposed to them being used for somebody else's interest under the exploitation racket. And thus you have the female narcissist who attacked David under that pretense of him being the patriarchy, and thus was illegally restrained by the surveillance in a kidnapping scenario for being the patriarchy and being hyper masculine, which is the assertion of the capacity to engage in disciplined action excessive to the natural engagement of the testosterone or other chemicals in question, and thus the ability to engage in the actual training beyond the level of natural reception puts him above the beta scenario for the rapists who use the testosterone as a free ingestion of value, similar to how in Dragon Ball Z many of the classical races, like the Saiyans, relied on their natural power as opposed to the function of any training. And at that point, they undermine their capacity to engage in any disciplined growth, and in that action, undermine their own progress. And it being the same thing in that situation, um, would systemically, according to the same storyline, have hyper accelerated the those connected to the patriarchy exponentially beyond those who merely relied on their natural um, old money or other resources affiliated to that function. And in that engaged of anti-WASP activity, undermine the entire concept of the Confederates' white supremacist communism by the existence of male leadership, despite the fact that the male leadership at the time is a functioning baby, and thus the support companies for the boss baby generates the pretense of those having to prove themselves, and thus compels the subordinates to engage in that active masculinity and discipline at the service of their superior, creating a generically improved society and work experience. Now, this hyper accelerates the capacity of his performances beyond the white supremacists who systemically, as an aspect of their base reality, engage in the bigot tax, which only ironically deals with those that they are bigoted against and use their white supremacist communism in order to hyper ridiculous um, scripts against those parties to put them into a corner in favor of the white supremacist communism, and thus they are turned into a gimmick instead of a thing that needs to be respected, at which point you have the produced outcome of a defective culture, which then is referred to as the reason for their inferiority, as opposed to any crimes that they would have been committed against them in order to reinforce that position for the illusion and its distraction, which is systemically ignored by the delusional who know what the trick is and refuse to admit to it under the problem with their entire self identity collapsing if they don't have the delusion to cling to, and thus in their kidnapping scheme are capable by virtue of their control to write an abuse theater script or a simulation, which creates their ability to engage in the defects of their superiors by the injuring of them in the kidnapping, similar to the movie The Precious, where there's a girl who is in a bad situation with her mama who's jealous of her, who makes her outrageously fat so that her pedophile boyfriends will be attracted to her instead of the girl that she's taking care of. And so she keeps on putting her in abusive situations, such as forcing her to eat overly fat foods and not being able to exercise or take care of herself. And thus, you generate the hyper bloated, ridiculous function in order to make the minor less attractive than the adult, and thus the abuser would then go to the adult woman. And so, in that separation, the delusional psychopaths with the white supremacist insurrection, being the beta cuck variant, have to hyper ridiculify the left into a hyper leftist position for the feminists, such as the selling for the female Gnostics or the witches, who are then given the powers and thus the higher respect in order to collapse the earned respect for all women, which had been hard fought for, which is then consumed and discarded by the female Gnostics, who are planning on collapsing the entire future societies anyways, as it's irrelevant as long as they're able to get the payment, such as, but is not limited to, the fake Green parties, which have been relying on the destruction of the electric car in the 80s and the destruction of the hydrogen vehicles in the 80s so that they can have something to complain about with the high exhaust vehicles. Um, Being able to have something to complain about gives them attention. That attention gives them political power. That political power gives them money. And this goes on as a system of racketeering or RICO violation. And these systems compound as a standard function of life for the white supremacist communists, which have engaged in these abuses against the general market, such as the Plato's conspiracy, which is the rape culture, where they use the government to manipulate the freedom of associations so that they can redirect all of the sexual options to their rape contracts, and anyone who engages in rape that's not specifically on those contracts that is able to find a replacement receipt is then protected from the recourse by the person who would be raped, and thus you create the hashtag MeToo movement generated by the system of the white supremacist abuse against the general public as a general way of life by the function of criminalizing evidence. And in the censorship of the general system, you have their editing, where they, having set up obvious gotcha moments while at the same time not actually being that bright, create this straw man arguments for a false opposition who sells the false opposition position, which is then redistributed as the proof that they don't actually have anything wrong with them, while covering for the offenses that are very real and continuing to be a systemic issue. This then being hyper countered by the super effective male leadership from the patriarchy, generates the position of the insurrectionists having to give David all of his properties back and then pay for their peace agreements along with the rest of it, includes, but it's not limited to, the returning of the supermodels, which as a foundational quality in the market would have been hyper accelerated to their value, at which point the white supremacist position of the superiority of guys over girls creates the dystopic problem from all of their undermining of women's progress, which is consumed by the female Gnostics, which then loses under the competent male leadership in actual consistent efforts um, by the women led by the patriarchy, would then be able to overcome the collective pretense of the hyperactive white supremacist market from those promoting the male companies or hyper masculine involved companies, which generates a amount of resources that we're able to track in the general market compared to the obstructed contracts from those examples, which would be more sensitive than the rest of the market, as this would physically disprove them scientifically, as opposed to the regular losing because of the normal contest against the thing that they view as the same category. And thus, the existence of the male leadership defeating them with women becomes hypersensitive to them, and thus would generate aggressive retaliation from the 90s, as that was in the 90s a relevant aspect of their self identity, which could then be evolved and transformed into the various cliques and jargons, and however they want to evolve their illusions can then be adapted, which is only really adapted as a fake pretense of progress under the position that they feel that they have to because there's something pushing them into becoming reasonable as opposed to the function of them actually wanting it. And thus, in that action, generates a trap for those parties, such as the ones consumed for the female narcissists, which will completely collapse their platform, sending them all the way back to the bottom where their historic group would have come from, and at that point generate the major losses derived by that collapse, which is accelerated because of the threat of the competition, which would have hyper accelerated itself, compelling them to be more and more reasonable by their competition with David, which forces them to give up their identity, which was one of the corresponding arguments for why they wouldn't sell him Hollywood, which they felt that they had to for their original agreement, because then the rapists who were found to be the leaders in Hollywood as rapists, who were picked for the quality of being a rapist, wouldn't have received those benefits and thus would not have the payoffs for associating with the Confederates, forcing them to give up their core identity as people who are incapable of performing on their own and thus crippled and reliant on communism for anything that they could acquire. And having been captured and radicalized by the cultists, found themselves systemically stuck in an inescapable loop of their own making, the hell spawn that is the existence of the communist system for their charismatic socialism and other collective defects as a genuinely unenjoyable aspect of society, even for the winners. They themselves self identify as losing. In the action that they have to compete in the free market, however, they deal with the hyperaccelerants of that activity. And in the action where they have to acknowledge the original obstructed contracts, they generate the arguments for those various parties who are accelerating themselves off of using the scraps from the obstructed contracts to make that progress, which is promoted by the threat of the competent free market being able to be resurrected if they don't have the support of those parties, compelling the increase of power and money and recognition to groups and individuals who would otherwise be viewed with contempt and systemically ignored, such as, but is not limited to, the function of women who were abused even in Hollywood on screen, where they would get slapped or punched as a regular aspect, such as in the 1950s and 1960s, etc., which, being an aspect of their normal activity, is a credible threat for them to return to if they are not able to gain momentum in David's case of the restoration of his title in favor of the rule of law, and with the establishment of the patriarchy and the obstructed contracts to be returned, the compulsion to recognize them as respectful aspects of society which deserve their rights. The issue is capitalists trade money and communists trade people, and the function of the white supremacists would work everyone to death until they could be discarded or replaced by artificial intelligence or some such system, which would then make them useless eaters, which then generates the capacity for the murder hobos mass suicide in their ritual sacrifices to their devils, which is functionally the foundation of those who are in control of these structures currently. They adopted the USSR's Soviet functions in communism under the pretense of Marxism as its worship of the devil in the early literature, where Marx had confessed to being a Satan worshiper and it being the foundation of his schemes when he wrote the fraudulent parts of communism as the function of his uh, religious duties. So, in their topsy turvy world, they would use every fraudulent illusion in order to generate these pretenses of illogical functions in society. So, let's take someone who would have otherwise been successful in the market. They were targeted by the white supremacists to be collapsed in a lower status from the communism central planning against the American Constitution. That person then is crippled and humiliated in all of the ritual abuses, which then generates the pretense of anything that they would have succeeded with to be degraded as a function of attacking their strength for its humiliation, so that if that person would then compare themselves to another party who isn't being restricted, they could then be mocked by virtue of referring to the illusion. At which point, the person who would have legally been hyper wealthy will say that a reasonable wealth of within $10 million or something, yeah? That person would have been stable and contributing to the general society, and everything would be fine. But then they're collapsed in that system by the obstruction of contracts, which ultimately could be compulsions by force into the collective socialist system from the restructured communism. At which point they would be hyper reliant on the socialist programs such as the Social Security, um, Medicare, Medicaid, and as anyone who's able to have reasonable connections with the Indians understand, socialism sucks. It's just it's it doesn't matter how you sell it. It's just a shit sandwich. The function collapses every aspect of humanity. It's not viable in any way, shape, or form, but in the compulsion of strong arming them by the hate crimes of the economic violence to compel them into the socialism, then degrades them into the living off the Social Security and others, and then those federal trusts, which are owed debts from the federal government, are then not paid because should the government have to pay the government? The answer is the Social Security is a trust for the civilian benefactors as opposed to the function of the government, as it is a trust separate to that engagement, which was then um, attacked by the Confederate led functions in Congress towards the end of Bill Clinton's presidency, where they strong armed him into being able to get loans from the trust, which is illegal at the time. So they were looking for an exception so that they could pull off the scheme of getting loans from it for the war on terror, which then would mature into the function of being able to say that they don't have to pay back Social Security because it is an aspect of the federal government, as opposed to it being an independent identity. A trust is not the person who created the trust, it is a different person. Corporations are people. The owner who creates a company creates a different identity, creates a different person. Someone who creates a trust creates a different person. The tax ID is different from the trust and the benefactors and the other parties that would have created it, similar to the companies. It is a completely separate identity, taxable as its own person, separate to everything else. And in that subversion by those frauds, engaged in that con, which generates the gutting of it by the hyperacceleration of the debts owed to it and taken out of it without the repayment, in a system by the white supremacists to collapse those programs from the federal socialist programs, such as Social Security, Medicaid, and the rest of them. And once they're collapsed, then the trap is basically shut, and there is no way to escape. And the engaged in the compulsion of the socialism in order to make everyone over rely on it at a unsustainable quantity is an attack on their existence, period, by criminal communism from white supremacist hate groups. Since these violations are materially true, anything that the Confederates in their war against the United States doing mockery warrants give the justification of the war in order to collapse the United States. So a warrant, you would say, the person to be targeted and the thing to be seized, and the excuse where they have to come up with a reasonable argument to a judge to co-sign the warrant. It's the same thing with the Confederates, except for the reason is its importance to the American society. And the capacity to collapse the American society requires it being removed so that in its absence, the injury can fester as much as possible. Like their targeting of David Bowles to remove him from the intelligence oversight so that they can sell the lies for the wars in the Middle East, uh, so they could get into their illegal wars, such as in Iraq, etc., or the function of removing him from his air security companies, which would have stopped 9/11, which generated these compounding errors. Now, the function of having removed it means, by definition, anyone who tries to replace it is triggering the violation of the same warrant. So let's say, for example, the original associations would have put David in Hollywood that they would have had to have sold him to, which would then break down into him brokering the contracts where he would sell off Hollywood arbitrarily until he would manage the active trading of the market for it to make the exchanges, such as the School of Hard Knocks, which would have promoted the artistic functions, which they would have had to have created a campus in Malibu for their original sale to acquire their objectives. Now, in that relationship, he would have actively been involved in movies and TV, etc., and been hyper competent in all of the various specific obligations for the function of their market. Now, as a function of a automated function of his knowledge in that scenario, you would engage in it being a recessive hobby where he would go back to it and do profitable contracts, basically, um, as a part-time function, which would generate for his times off when he's doing stressful jobs or whatever in the original estimate. And thus the act of him originally having it as backup hobbies for his vacations and times to enjoy himself and recover and recuperate and enjoy his life, it would be a material aspect of his original human decency, which those who are trying to sacrifice him for the Satanist objectives um, are trying to collapse the status by the undermining of the contracts. And if you replace the human decency in some other way, let's pretend a charity existed that was trying to make those connections or whatever, it would specifically be barred from doing so on the pretense that it's a part of the original value being sacrificed under the Confederates' war efforts against the United States, barring the capacity for it being reintroduced. Thus, the position, such as the War on David channels, which are the super reduced edits under drunk notes, where the censorship and editing allows for vague aspects of reality to seep through under the unrefined aspects, under the hyper stress and destabilized functions, during the war effort where uh, there's very little time to put together a script or rehearse or do any of the necessary preparations instead of just blurt it out in the middle of a contest. So let's say you're doing a normal contest. Most people have a lot of practice before they go into a game, and the function is the undermining of the practice. So then the game becomes the time for practice. But if the game becomes the time for the practice and they engage in the undermining of the contracts, then they can forfeit without the formal recognition, which ruins the game, which then ruins the practice. And thus, this scenario generates the obligation of the least competent variation of puking it out, and thus the justification of it not seeming as tolerable as what otherwise would seem hyper enjoyable, as it is the least value of the information being communicated as possible under their agreements for this smear factory, under their censorship and reduction by the edits, similar to in Bruce Almighty when he's going to, I think it was Evan, uh, in the reporting room where Bruce whispers to the side a bunch of gibberish, and he forces Evan to engage in the gibberish in front of the reporting camera to make it as worse as possible. And so there is no way to stop the actual attack itself, except for do the thing when the attack isn't happening. And as long as they have access to it, it generates the pretense to the attack, and thus anything that doesn't fit their arbitrary muse is then sabotaged, generating the systemic reductions as an illusion for the reference of the inferiority of their competition, which they feared would have beaten them in the fair contests, where all of the things wouldn't have been undermined by the existence of a competent government capable of doing law enforcement, which would then have arrested them and stopped them from their sabotage of the underlining value um, in their war against the government and their war against the Constitution. And many of these functions comes from double agents, including those who have infiltrated Congress, the judiciary, and other key locations, which are barred by their activities from by the Constitution, which specifically states that they don't have authority to have co-signed these actions, which would amount to an act of insurrection, which bars them from the office, and thus you have a bunch of parties who are barred from Congress by the self-acting action from the Constitution, which is delayed by their sedition, removing all of the law enforcement actions that would have conducted that, generating the mechanism in the absence of those law enforcement to continue those actions, which hyper accelerates the voter fraud, which replaces the Americans' government with the Confederates' government, disconnecting the civilians from all authority over the government and any influence, such as the barring of uh, being able to complain to the government for a competent reception of a remedy to secrets or wizard spells by their hate group, at which point the incapacity of the general public to be able to engage with the government increases the tensions and retaliations and the general violence as they escalate for the problem to exist so they can put down the problem as they are an organized militant function as opposed to the arbitrary civilian population, which is not a trained military. And if every problem is a nail, then it doesn't matter that you're a hammer. But if you are a hammer, and everything that you know how to use is a hammer, then everything else has to be a nail. And the function of the Confederates overthrowing the American government means, by definition, they have to make everything a hammer, so that the trap becomes that the Americans who are not loyal to communism or white supremacy or any of the other nonsense distributed by the Confederates would then be tricked into the undermining of their own interests and to the interest of the society and of the government, by the excessive reliance on the cheese or spamming, etc. actions, which then destabilizes the structure by its lack of competence and order, and thus undermine the function of checks and balances, and thus undermine the function of justice, and thus cripples the justice system, and thus turns it into a twisted joke of itself. Many of their schemes have a bait and switch quality, which relies on the assumption of everyone to agree to the delusion of the unit of their first category, and then they switch it with the second category and then the third category and so on. At which point the assumption of the different layers, take for instance the example of competing in the practice versus competing in the contest after the maturity of the practices. These are different categories. The function of doing the thing while sober versus doing it while intoxicated as a separate category. The function of doing it without weights versus doing it with weights, and then exponentially increasing the quantity of complications in the weights or other complications that have nothing to do with the weights. These are all separate categories, and the function of conducting the bait and switch in the middle of the conversation is fundamental to each and every one of their progresses on the false assertion of the lie that they're telling. At which point, their consistent changing of the subject is a renouncing of base principles, and anyone who renounces base principles is impossible to talk to, as you cannot negotiate with someone who you cannot agree with the first principles on, as their rejection of reality in their perpetual manipulation by virtue of their advantages, giving them the capacity to sell their delusions, allows them to consistently switch the subjects while censored, allows them the capacity to engage in the edits, selling the edited products for the defamation and the smear factory to a completely different party outside of it being dealt with from the raw position to the general group, which then would have been too diverse for them to sell the product to, as the product is specifically edited and tailored for specific parties to be manipulated at specific times in order to gain key advantages by the military tactics in the civilian contest, and thus overrun the function of better, more vigorous, more vital talent in the subject by the use of violence in the nonviolent contest, otherwise known as a hate crime or economic violence, social violence, political violence, and so forth. At which point, their position is not something that they submit to the court of records to be consumed by the general public fairly and correctly, because these are not even the function of a color of law activity, but merely disguised by malicious fraud, as the function is exclusively the misuse of government equipment for the distribution of hate crimes, as the wholesale function as a hate crime, as they are a denomination of the Confederate militia, consistently known as the KKK, amongst other factions of the Confederacy, which had to create the different factions in order to regain lost ground to the Americans who began to progress past their historic embarrassments, and in that action required the evolution of the white supremacists in their subversion of the general community, such as their position of the hyper ridiculous position of the wokeness, and those who go woke get broke, becoming the general meme, is generated on the basis that the white supremacists created an extremist left position, which could not be tenable, as it is the straw man argument of the white supremacists on why being the white supremacist is the only viable means of existing in a society, by the contrast of severely different positions, both of them ridiculous and dangerous, instead of the settlement of reason in the general society, which allows for the rest of the categories which would have been viable without the subversion. And thus, with the censorship of speech and others, you have the removal of everything that isn't themselves or their gimmick replacement. And since if there's only them or their gimmick replacement, you have to choose between the lesser of two evils as opposed to the creation of the more obvious, immediate, desirable obligations that they had already established in their obligation to have been reasonable in the first place when dealing with the progressing society which is trying to ignore them, which is getting pulled back by them in this function, creating these military operations by their unprofessional forces. And the national capitalism being referred to as capitalism when distributing the pretense of the solution, which is capitalism, against their crony capitalism, generates their switching of the subjects for their national capitalism when trading with other societies and individuals inside the general market derived by the function of their capacity to national capitalism as their plantations are the function of their entire commune or their socialist utopia for the white supremacists controlled over those who are equal in this socialism and those who are more equal having to run the socialism in question. And thus, whenever the arguments are brought up in order to collapse the threat, it is then referred to as the solution, which is then switched with the actual solution. And so the function of capitalism becomes the problem, which is the only actual remedy, and thus collapses their capacity to have gained any momentum as they are attacking the only means to escape the hellhole created for them, where they are permanently trapped in this insufferable white hot forceful lava, generating their permanent state of misery, as the function of abuse is the standard function of their society in that communist nowhere. And that communist nowhere, known as no place, becomes their utopian dream. And when you dream of utopia by the white supremacists, you have communist nightmares. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and many of the white supremacist systems have infiltrated intelligence communities, such as the CIA, in the creation of the freedom fighter investments, which has created such groups as the Taliban in the Middle East, which are then labeled as terrorist organizations when no longer directly viable, and thus if you want to know who our future enemies are, look at who the Confederates are promoting today, because they're going to be corrupted and turned into the bad guy in the future, at which point they're able to be used to the nth degree until they're completely exhausted and collapsed under the gimmick for the war as a racket function, which requires the perpetual profiteering off of war as a mechanism from their Moriarty-based tactics, functioning their false intelligence based on fraud in the distribution of their lies in order to continue the permanent state of those rackets, and thus the forever wars are the status quo function until there are no more people to kill or no more sons to sacrifice. And these systems, hyper-violent functions, use that hyper-violence to capture or to corrupt any of the criminal organizations or terrorist organizations, etc. Um, Not just the ones that are mislabeled, but the ones that actually are the gimmick, become the function of the status quo indirect army, which, as an unprofessional force, become subordinate phantom cells to that mechanism, at which point they engage in the murder horrible functions from their low contact missions directly enforcing the function for their various distractions, which compels them, similar to the function of Obama and ISIS, creates the capacity of the hyperfunding, such as the leaving of military resources, such as gold and oil and weapons, um, for ISIS when they are collapsed at their all-time weakest point in order to hyper accelerate their function, um, because of their convenient use in the racketeering war, um, and their general control over their other issues, similar to the function of their attempts to overthrow the other governments, such as the Libyans and Gaddafi, which I believe was attacked by ISIS, but I'm not specifically sure. But these types of missions are derived by it being a phantom cell function, and thus an unprofessional military disconnected, which is similar to the function of mercenary forces, except for it is the high intelligence spy function that, if caught, the government will deny all connections to you. And in the function of it being at that level, does not have the prestige specifically connected to it, and it maintains all of the original risks as they are viewed as not the right type of white and thus extraordinarily expendable. So you can never get an end to the primary resources such as drugs, because the function of their crime is the thing that is sustaining them, and they are a puppet of the white supremacist militia, and thus the function of the white supremacist military operations for the Confederacy needing them to exist in an automated function without direct activity of funding them requires the protection of that system, and thus it requires the function of the criminalizing of that system. And thus, if everything was cleaned and became something else, we'll call it avocados, then the function of avocados would have to become criminalized in order to hyper accelerate the function of the aggression, which makes it dangerous. And the act of radicalizing it into the danger increases the risk, and thus increases the cost of business, and thus increases their general prices, which are then sustained at that protected price, allowing them to launder the additional resources necessary in order to sustain that business model for their forces, generating the general state of a permanent military coup, such as the cartels in Mexico, which have basically postured themselves as a rival to the government, which generates um, all of the indirect intimidation that the white supremacists want, such as the acceptable aspects of it that the legitimate government of the United States is willing to accept, but doesn't want to ask any questions about the secrets or how they're operated, at which point you have the function of the general threat consistently maintained as the status quo, which generates their consistent posturing towards their coups as they engage in those positions in order to overthrow the governments at any variable time as a consistent threat, which they have enforced historically arbitrarily, even against those that have fully participated in cooperation with the United States, having been directly betrayed in favor of the arbitrary whims of the white supremacists enforcing their communism, including but not limited to the actual gimmick for the banana republics, which, as you all guessed it, was created by the white supremacist communism as an enforcement standard function, demonstrating how the white supremacists prefer to operate a socialist utopia.